off his horse! Over to the hospital! Privates, dismount!
Haywood, find the medic!
Where's that sergeant?
Get a sergeant up here! Hurry!
Invite them people into the tent. They can come in.
Folks, come on in here. Take a look at this. General Forrest has been slayed out in the field.
Sergeant. Get your coat off, please. Coat off. You're gonna have to help me. His arm's that done. It's not unusual on the jackets. Yep. Go. Have a seat, sir. I'll tell you one thing, if that boy had known to give me the point of this thing instead of just slash me, I wouldn't even be here.
I think you may have to lose your arm, sir.
You see that, Sergeant? There's nothing wrong with this arm. Wrap her up.
Sergeant, we need our general out in the field again. This battle's not ending today.
We got a courier here.
Yes, sir.
Haywood,
Yes, sir.
I want you to go out to the bridge. You tell them Alabamians to get off their horse, form a line on that bridge. Captain Morton's artillery is to get on that bridge and be able to rifle down that bridge. Them Federals got to come across that bridge.
Yes, sir.
Now hold on, son. Farther up the creek is Buford's battalion. You find a way across the creek into the woods. When the Federals mass to come across that creek, Buford is to come out of those woods with everything he has, and we'll catch him in between.
Yes, sir.
No prisoners, boy.
Got it. Godspeed, Private!
Are these the new recruits? Are these the people who come in transferred from the east?
I believe so, sir.
Have a seat. Have a seat. Come in and have a seat. Have a seat. My name is Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, you troops have transferred from the east, and you're more welcome here than you can believe, because we are short-handed. The fighting in the west here, in Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, is considerably different than what you're used to in the east. In the east, the battles are around the capital cities, Washington and Richmond. They're within 100 miles of those cities. Thank you, sir.
There you go, sir.
We got another gentleman. Where that other gentleman? Yeah, thank you.
Gentlemen, hope you join up. We will.
Here in the west, the fighting revolves around the rivers and railroad centers. The first 2 years revolved around the Mississippi River. Whoever controlled the Mississippi controlled how commerce was going up and down the Mississippi. The Federals had a major supply depot in Cairo, Illinois, and if they controlled the Mississippi River, they could put supplies in Memphis, they could put supplies in Vicksburg, they could put supplies all the way down into New Orleans. If we controlled the Mississippi, they couldn't do that. So the first 2 years, the Federals were trying to control the Mississippi. The second 2 years was control of the railway centers, Chattanooga, Nashville, and Atlanta. These places are much farther away than in the east. Washington, D.C. are within 100 miles of each other. We're talking 300 and 400 miles. So that's why the fighting is much, much different. Is you have to be able to move your troops a long ways off, and that's the difference. Another difference in the west and the east is the population centers. The population centers in the west, Memphis, my hometown, during the 1860 census was 17,000 people. The major city of Memphis is 17,000 people. The population centers here in Washington and Baltimore and Philadelphia, considerably more than that. The other thing that's different here in the west than the east is the media. In the east, the media was very good. In the west, not so much. Now, when this war began, I was against it. I started life, 1821 is when I was born. I was the first of 12 children. My family was very poor. From the time that I was 16 when my father died until the start of the war when I was 39, in Southern society you have enslaved blacks, freed blacks, poor white, farmers, merchants, planters, and large planters. That's the hierarchy in Southern society. I started off as poor white. My greatest accomplishment in life is, in 1860, I was a large planter. I owned Green Grove in Mississippi, a plantation that produced 1,000 bales of cotton. A bale of cotton by the Cotton Exchange weighs 550 pounds, so 1,000 bales of cotton. And we also had a hardwood mill that we did 10,000 board foot of wood every year. So I moved up that ladder of success, and it's very difficult to do that. I voted against the war in 1861. Why would I vote anything for it? I was moving up and I was making money. I was a wealthy man. I had over $1 million in 1861. I voted against the war. I was happy with the way things were going. And then Mr. Lincoln's little adventure in Charleston Harbor, we voted again in June of 1861. My vote was unable to preserve the peace. My two boys, my youngest son Willie, he was 14 at the time, and my youngest brother, Jeffrey, were all into the war. That war. So I thought the best way that I could preserve them was by joining the Army. So in June of 1861, I went down to the Geisha Hotel in Memphis and I joined Captain Clark's Mounted Infantry. Now, much has been made about me being the only man in the Civil War who joined as a private and ended up as a lieutenant general. I didn't stay a private for long. I was a private from June of 1861, and by July of 1861, Governor Harris called me into his office. I had known him, and he asked me to form my own battalion of cavalry, and I was commissioned a lieutenant colonel. So it took 1 month to go from private to lieutenant colonel. I formed my own battalion, and one of the things I noted when I was a private is Captain Clark had a fine uniform. If you look at Captain Shipley over there, it was very similar to that. Captain's bars and braid on the side. We were promised all these fabulous uniforms at Camp Randolph above Memphis. Uniforms and horses and artillery and guns. And that's what we did. We went up there, and you know what we found? Nothing. Not a single cannon. We had to bring our own horses. And I realized right then and there that the Confederate government was not going to be able to provide us. So I had to provide for ourselves. And that's exactly what we did. When I was commissioned a lieutenant colonel, I went back to Green Grove, my plantation, and I said to those 45 slaves that I had, boys, this war is all about slavery. If the Federals win, you'll be made free. If we win and you run my teams for me, I'll make you free. I had 45 of my 47 slaves joined up with me. I didn't ask them to fight, but they did run my wagons and ran my teams. Better Confederates there ever was. Of those 47, 45 surrendered with me at Gainesville in 1865. They're very fine men. Many of them took up arms. I went up to Louisville and with those boys, and we purchased our own saddles and our own pistols. for our own self. So from the very beginning, I had to provide for myself. My first battle action was at Sacramento, Kentucky. It was December 28th, 1861. I was moving in to Sacramento, ordered to patrol the area. We came through the town of Sacramento. This young gal, Molly, she was a blonde-haired girl, about 16 years old. She was on her horse. There they are, there they are. She was pointing at them. So I gave my first orders. Draw sabers. Come on, boys, mix in with them. I spurred my horse. I look over, Molly's right alongside. So get her to the rear. We fought. My horse was a little bit faster than the other horses. I got in with the Federals. There were 4 or 5 of them around me. I pulled my saber. I knocked 3 of them off their horse. I shot 2 of them, and my horse knocked another one off. So my first battle, I killed 3 Federals. My second battle was at Fort Donelson. There's a guy sitting in the audience who resembles my opponent at Fort Donelson. It was the first time I encountered General Grant. Now, there's a lot of people who say this and that about General Grant. General Grant came to fight. He outnumbered me. I was simply the cavalry commander at the time. He brought in gunboats, Fort Donelson. We fought for 3 days, and finally the Confederate generals at Fort Donelson decided it would be better to surrender. They called a meeting. They said they were surrendering. I looked at them. I did not come here to surrender my battalion. I'd got my boys up in the saddle, and out we went. We found a road that was submerged, and out we went. My next, I saved a whole battalion, 500 men. My next battle was in April 7th and 9th, 1862. Does anybody know April 7th and 9th, 1862? Once again, I met General Grant. That's the Battle of Shiloh. I was ordered to be on the right flank to cover for a landing in Shiloh. During the battle, no one was landing, so I dismounted my men and I moved them right into the hornet's nest. My boys fought as much and as hard as anybody fought. That evening, we were relieved because we were out of ammunition. We couldn't go any farther. And I was ordered to scout around, and I did scout. And when I scout, I personally scout. I always personally scout. I don't carry binoculars, I personally scout. I reported back to Albert Sidney Johnson had been killed, and the Beauregard was in charge. And I reported back to Hardy and Beauregard, Breckinridge, and I told them, I said, boys, they are reinforcing. Buell's boats, transports were coming ashore, and I told them that. Well, I was not a West Point general, and they didn't think much of me not being a West Point general, and they said, Colonel, go back to your group, it's fine, it's fine. I told them, I said, we either fight tonight or we have to get out of here because we are going to get beat tomorrow. Well, they did not listen to me, they were not interested in what I had to say, and we got beat the next day. I was ordered to cover the retreat. Mr. General Sherman was forcing us. General Sherman here today?
He is indeed.
He was. At Fallen Timbers was the first time I encountered General Sherman. The Confederate Army was retreating down through Corinth. I fought the Federals on every nook, every turn that I possibly could. At a place called Fallen Timbers, I saw an opportunity. I spurred my horse into them, and the rest of my boys, they didn't come. They stayed back. I was surrounded by a mess of Federals. That was the first time I was wounded. One Federal put his gun right here on my side and shot, lifted me out of the saddle, but the bullet landed against my spine. I was finally able to get that horse turned around. This side of myself was all paralyzed. I got that horse turned around and I made my way out, and that was the first time that I got wounded, Fallen Timbers. I was wounded 3 times more during the course of the battle, including this slashing that you just saw. The commander of the Army of Tennessee was a fellow named Braxton Bragg. Now, Braxton Bragg made it a point to say he did not like volunteers, and he did not like people from Tennessee. Well, I'm a volunteer and I'm a man from Tennessee. General Bragg and I did not get along very well. The first thing he did was take my command from me, which did not sit well with me because, as I said, I paid for all their equipment. I paid for their weapons, their saddles, their horses. He took his command from me. He told me, I'm taking your command. You're in Eastern Tennessee in the Chattanooga division. Come up with a new command and you'll be the general. Well, I was able to do that. I was able to recruit a new command in Eastern Tennessee. 4,000 men. I was made general. We fought at Murfreesburg. We fought at Nashville. And we won. I was able to go to the federal supplies. We beat those folks. And I took all their weapons, and I took their horses. When I went into Murfreesboro, half of my men walked, and when I came out, they all had horses, they all had weapons, and they all had blue uniforms. And what did Mr. Bragg do? He took my 2nd division from me. He gave them to Joe Wheeler, fighting Joe Wheeler. Joe Wheeler is about this tall. Okay. Joe Wheeler could not fight his way out of a paper sack, but he was a West Point man. I never rubbed my back up against a college or a military institution, but every time I did go against those West Point boys, I usually put it to them. I usually beat them up pretty good. Well, Joe Wheeler took my men and he was ordered to attack Dover, and he attacked Dover. Half of my men were killed. And I said to Joe Wheeler that night, I was in his headquarters, I said, he was writing a report to Bragg, and he was saying how uncoordinated the attack was. And I told Joe Wheeler, I said, I have no complaint with my men. I said, and you tell this to General Bragg, I'll be in my coffin before I ever fight again with you. I did not get along very well with most of these generals, these West Point guys. I fought at Chickamauga. Chickamauga was right after Gettysburg. Right after Vicksburg. General Grant had taken Vicksburg. Now, Gettysburg and Vicksburg happened in the same week. First week in July of 1863. Many of you know about Gettysburg, all written about Gettysburg. The media, the press, all about Gettysburg. But it was much more important to take Vicksburg because it opened up the Mississippi River and its tributaries to federal supplies and federal transports and federal gunships. This was a standoff here. The Federals and the Confederates in Gettysburg lost about the same amount of men, but taking Vicksburg and opening up that Mississippi was doomed for the Confederacy. It was much more important. I fought at Chattanooga. That's when Longstreet's Corps came in by railroad, and we finally had a Confederate victory in the West. Finally had a Confederate victory. I went to Bragg and I said, "What? It's time. Follow it up. We got him. Follow it up. Follow it up." He was there, standing around, accepting praise. Accepting praise. I looked at him. I said, "I am about sick and tired of you. I've put up with your meanness as long as I can. You've taken 2 of my battalions away from me. If you ever cross my path again, if you ever issue me another order, it will be a peril to your life." And walked out of there. Well, they didn't think too much of that. Me being a brigadier general and he being a lieutenant general. Jefferson Davis came down and asked me to meet him in Atlanta. I took the train to Atlanta. Made me a major general at the time. I had to recruit another battalion. I had to recruit another army, which I did very well in West Tennessee. I was in charge of all cavalry in West Tennessee. I believe at that time General Grant was moved east. General Sherman was in charge in the Western Theater. General Sherman said nice things about me. He called me the devil. He said if it took 100,000 men and broke the treasury, it was worth killing me. I took that as a tremendous compliment. He said my force only was about 3,000 men. The Naval Strength Brigade, General Straight, had 7,000 men. And dozen artillery pieces. I had 3,000 men and 4 artillery pieces. General Strait put his men on mules because we were fighting through Alabama. It's a very rough country. He thought the mules would be better footed, and I didn't even have to send out scouts. I could hear them damn mules from 100 miles away. I knew exactly where he was. And this is where I grew up with. I knew every path, every deer path, every animal path, every back road there was. I ran that man all up. Those men were famished when I was done with it. What I did is I finally caught them, and I invited General Strait to my headquarters, and I had my men march around in a circle. So those 3,000 men, he thought he was going up against 24,000 men. And those 4 cannons, he thought he was going up against 16 cannons. He even asked me, he said, General, I counted 16 cannons. He said, how many do you have? I said, 16, that's all kept up, I guess. So we finally negotiated a surrender. I said, go have your men stack your arms over there. They stacked their arms over there. And I brought my men out, and he realized that he had 3 times the amount of men that I had. He wanted his arms back, but all's fair in love and war, and I took that. That was a straight raid. There were many other raids that they were coming against me. You may have heard of Bryce's Crossroads, Mississippi, 1864. Very similar situation. 24,000 Federals against my 3,000 Confederates. Well, it was hot, it was rainy. Those horses that the Federals had were artillery horses. They were big, heavy horses, and they couldn't get through the rain and get through the mud. And I ran them all down through southern Mississippi. It was in June. I ran them all the way through. By the time they were done, I knew exactly what was going to happen at Bryce's Crossroads. Bryce's Crossroads, people were very kind and tell me that was my finest battle. I knew the Federal cavalry would come up, and I had enough to whip the Federal cavalry. And then they called in the Federal infantry, and those boys were huffing and puffing, and it was 104 degrees out there, and they were huffing and puffing. By the time they got there, they had thrown off their knapsacks, they had thrown down their guns. It was an easy fight for us. It was an easy fight for us, so we took them. You may have heard of Fort Pillow. Fort Pillow is 50 miles north of Memphis. People say that my troops massacred the Federals. It really didn't happen. There were 600 Federals and I had 1,500 Confederates. The Federals were ill-equipped to face us. They had long guns and artillery, and we had pistols. So while they were ramming their guns, their muskets, my boys were just going up and shooting. And we had the high ground, we had more guns, and we had more people. And while it was an unfair fight, I think they lost around 300, I lost 14. There was no massacre, there was no criminal intent there. The war ended for me after the Battle of Franklin and the Battle of Nashville. John Bell Hood took over the Army of Tennessee, and he asked me to, I was his cavalry commander. General Hood had been severely wounded many times during the war, and my way of thinking, his thinking was not quite right. Frontal assaults at that time at the end of the war just simply were not going to work. And I had said to General Hood, I said, give me an hour and give me 1 infantry division and I will flank these boys. And he insisted on a frontal assault, and he ruined his army. I was able to get it out of Tennessee back into Mississippi, but there wasn't much left of it. In February of 1865, I was made Lieutenant General in charge of all cavalry in the southern, southwestern, and that's how I ended up. My group was the last army in the field east of the Mississippi. After General Lee and General Johnstone surrendered, mine was the last army east of the Mississippi. I'm very proud of our accomplishments for a unit my size, basically a brigade. I captured 31,000 Federals. I killed 76,000 Federals. I captured 62 pieces of artillery. I'm the only man in history to capture 5 gunboats with cavalry. I left the war. We surrendered in Gainesville, Alabama in May of 1865. And that's where we are. I was asked by Governor Harris at that time to continue to fight. And I looked at Governor Harris of Tennessee and I said, this war is over and we have lost. And anybody who wants to fight should go to an insane asylum. Governor, I'm going home. And that's what I'll say to you folks. I'm going home. Thank you very much. When I speak as myself, third person, I don't wear General Forrest's jacket, so I will entertain questions without his jacket on. So are there any questions?
May I approach the gentleman?
Well, certainly.
I must say that I am enthralled by your presentation and discussion. May I add to and speak to these good people about you? First of all, I would have you know that Nathan Bedford Forrest, I have said many times, was the greatest cavalry leader in the Great War. Unquestionably, Forrest was the best. Now, not to qualify that praise, I will tell you that I have also said I regret that General Forrest did not have the opportunity to test his mettle against Phil Sheridan. I should like to have seen that. But as I emphasize, that does not qualify my praise. Forrest was the best cavalry leader either side produced during the war. General Forrest, as he pointed out, several things that I should like to follow up on. Forrest is the only cavalry leader that when I was taking reports daily, I would always ask, when I was told of cavalry activity, who the commander was. When I was told it was Forrest, I always laid down my pencil, folded my hands, and listened to pay attention to what General Forrest was doing. I first crossed sabers with Forrest at Fort Donelson. At that time, he was a colonel. When we went into Donelson, when Buckner surrendered, I found out after the fact that it meant little to me at that moment that Forrest had escaped with my reports were 700 men. A Colonel Forrest. A Colonel Forrest. Now, we got somewhere between 13 and 15,000 soldiers, and I must be vague there because it was early in the war. And our war was a learn as you go. We did not put up sentries around the surrendered army that Buckner had surrendered. Now, Buckner says he had 17,000. Our numbers ultimately were 13,000 that went north to prison camps. So some 4,000 to 5,000, 6,000 men found their way someplace else. And Forrest had escaped. Forrest became rapidly known. 7 weeks later, at Shiloh, I once again crossed swords with General Forrest. He's Colonel Forrest still at that time. And at the end of the battle, two things occurred. I had developed a very healthy respect for the Confederate soldier. And it was after Shiloh that I wrote, both in my memoirs and to my wife, that until this battle, I had assumed that there'd be one more great struggle and the war would be over, but Shiloh changed that thinking. At Shiloh, the Southern soldier showed what he could do. Now keep in mind, at Shiloh, it was little more than a civilian mob fighting each other. It is because very few men at that battle, that early in the war, had any experience in combat. it is remarkable that both sides stood and fought as they did. Forrest was in the thick of it. And as I was bringing Buell's army, 26,000 men, across the Tennessee River, and at that place, to give you perspective, the Tennessee River is as wide as from where you are sitting to where that tree line is. It's very narrow and shallow there at Shiloh, but that's the width of the river. And I was bringing 26,000 fresh troops across. None of Buell's troops fought in the first day. The battle was won without Buell. But overnight, in that terrible rainstorm, thundering, slashing rainstorm all night long, Colonel Forrest, as he stressed, he did his own reconnoiter. He went up on one of those Indian mounds, and if you ever have the opportunity to go to Shiloh, go on the Indian mounds. There are several ceremonial mounds. And you can stand where Colonel Forrest laid on his belly in the mud and watch those troops coming across the river in those steamboats. But Forrest did his own soldiering. He never sent a man to do something that he wouldn't do. So he's lying in the mud. He went back to Beauregard, and General Beauregard is another discussion for us, and told Beauregard what he said, that he just told you. They're bringing an entire army across that river. We've got to either fight them now or we're going to lose. And again, as the colonel said at that time, he was ignored, as he too often was ignored. Ultimately, to my benefit, Forrest was ignored. Forrest and Sherman did meet at Fallen Timbers. Beauregard was falling back,